In Path of Exile, one of the most common questions somebody who is learning the game will ask is, I am new to Path of Exile, should I use a guide first or no? And very often they are referring to a build guide. The question will go something like this. My favorite game of all time is Diablo 2, played D3, played D4, been longing for a game to scratch the itch of D2, but seeing the skill tree, it seems overwhelming. The skill gems, maybe they don't understand, maybe they don't understand defenses, or they hear you can brick your character. So they'll ask, should I use a guide in order to have the best experience possible? The argument towards using a guide would be that your experience will be easier to understand. It will teach you how at least one build works, so you can always rely on that build for future seasons, leagues. Basically, as the game progresses, you will have a comfort pick. You'll be able to actually get all the way through the campaign, and you'll experience a little bit of the in-game, so at least you get the opportunity to see what the game itself has to offer. Otherwise, you could probably brick your character or at least get stuck. And the counter arguments to this would be, well, if I don't want to use a guide, then I can have a more enjoyable experience of learning the game innately. Maybe I like doing blind runs. Maybe the process of it being difficult will be enjoyable to me. Maybe I just want to figure it out myself. These are typically the arguments you're going to see on either side of this one. Now, this was my original character, and I did not use a build guide to build this character, so the end result of my first character ended up being that I basically do no damage. I was semi-tanky, but not even as tanky as some of my further builds. I do no damage, and I eventually got to a position where I could not progress my character any further because I just don't have the stats and the build to be able to defeat the bosses I would need to be able to defeat to be able to continue the progression of this character. So this is sometimes what people mean when they refer to you can brick your character. They mean your character progressed up to a certain point and it's no longer strong enough to be able to progress. Now, on this character, I was able to clear through the campaign in some of the in-game Void Stone bosses, meaning some of the bosses that unlock things later in the game for you. I was not able to complete all of it. So my experience was only part of what the game has to offer my first run through. And the funny part about that is my character stopped really working at the point that the game really starts to get good. So my first run through this, I only really experienced the campaign, which at some points people get down to like 5 hours or less now. And I didn't really get to experience what makes Path of Exile good. Another thing that happened was because I was playing softcore trade, a lot of this gear that I ended up purchasing, I either would overpay or purchase gear that just basically didn't work with my build. I wasted a lot of the money that I had saved up throughout my time playing the game. So not only did I have a miss-optimal experience and miss portions of the end game, but also the time that I did have in the game and the progress I did make, I would very often waste by purchasing equipment that I thought looked good that literally either didn't work with my build or had an interaction that physically made my character worse. You could explain this away as learning moments that stuck with me. And while that would be true, they are also what I would refer to as quitting moments. These are moments when you realize you have made a major mistake and you lost 4 hours worth of grind time by making a irrelevant purchase or purchasing something that the price is way too high because you don't have one of the tools that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Then that might be a frustrating enough moment to say, you know what? I don't have enough hours in a day. This game is too complicated. I'm not interested in continuing to learn this. This feels like a second part-time job. I think I'm just going to go play something else. Now, one of the arguments I made to myself for the reason I didn't want to use like guides in the beginning of the game, and admittedly I had the chat teaching me literally anyway because I am a live streamer. I will be live today, as a matter of fact, with Path of Exile. But one of the arguments that I was making to myself is I wanted to have the enjoyability of learning Path of Exile. I thought that the learning process itself would be fun. But what I failed to realize is even if I had used the guide from the beginning of playing Path of Exile, that one, there's so much in Path of Exile that I could use a guide and still not scratch the surface and still have plenty of things to use. So if I had that basic build in the beginning to lean back on, a crutch of a build that I could continually come back to least progress through the game, that I would be able to go and then learn the other in-game or the league mechanics or what have you about the game. There's plenty of other things outside of that. But two, there's also other game modes. So once you understand the basics of Path of Exile, then you could say, okay, well, now I want to try it on hardcore if you're brave enough. Or maybe you want to be able to still die, but you want to collect the items yourself. So you do like a solo self-found mode. So there are variants based upon in the game that will still allow you new teaching moments in each of those. Hardcore will teach you defenses. Solo self-found will teach you acquisition methods for items. So if one of your concerns is, well, DM, I want to learn Path of Exile myself because I find challenges inspiring and informative, those still exist in the game, even if you do use a build guide your first time going through. One of the jokes you'll hear in Path of Exile once you get through the campaign and get to your hideout and eventually begin like the mapping in-game toward the progression is that congratulations, you have completed your tutorial. Now you can actually play the game. And they're right, because going through the campaign for the first time is a fun experience. You get to see what the game has to offer, but that's just it. You get to see what the game has to offer, and then the game offers it to you once you sort of get through the campaign. You'll hear the same joke once you get through all 16 tiers of maps. Congratulations, you have unlocked the tutorial. Now you can see what the game has to offer with its in-game. And that is also correct. You have gone through the tutorial and gone through enough of it to be able to see what you can have offered to you from the in-game too. That's sort of the beauty of Path of Exile, is it's a mini layered onion that joke is going to continue to happen and is going to continue to ring true. Something else to keep in mind is this learning philosophy of I want to do the build myself and figure out my own character can apply at any time. For instance, I am 800 hours into the game. We are just days away at this point in starting the new league, which is basically the new season for Path of Exile. And after 800 hours, I'm in a position, because of how many changes they've done, that everything that I knew about the builds that I had been using had been fundamentally changed. Meaning I'm right back at the chopping block of I don't know what build to use. I'm right back in the position of, am I going to use a build guide or am I going to try to figure myself something out here? So that ability is not going to be lost forever if you decide to use a build guide for your first time. To be fair, one thing that could happen when using a build, and I've tried a bunch of characters here, I have followed the build precisely twice now in the game. And one thing that did happen to me when I was doing a minion style build was that I felt like I was actually just really, really strong. And I was comparing this against the basic build I had. Things basically felt too easy because I was using this minion build where I was walking through and just one-shotting everything in it. I didn't really feel much of a challenge. So that is something that you could feel if you feel like you picked a super meta build. But the reality is, if you're doing it for your first time, you're having to understand the mechanics of the game. You're going to have to understand how skill gems work, how ascendancies work, how the bosses work, resistances, defenses, offenses, more versus increased damage. There's so many things to actually learn about the game that the reason people use builds in order to make the actual monsters and fighting of the game easier is to allow you to focus on how those other things work. So that if you do wish to do your own build, let's say on your second character or something like that, you at least know how a skill works so that you can have the ability to process enough of that information to at least have a fair shot at it. Path of Exile has one major flaw, which it is not new player friendly. It is very overly complicated. That is both a double-edged sword of why people like it, but also why some people cannot get into the game. So for myself, for somebody who has both tried playing the game without a guide, though admittedly I had a chat even teaching me along the way, and somebody who has later on looked into things like Bone Shatter to learn builds that seem pretty good and tried both of those, I do recommend, in its current iteration, I do recommend trying to use a build guide for your first playthrough, or else you run the risk of hating the game and not seeing the potential the game has to offer. One other point you're going to hear from veteran players when it goes to recommending new players is they're going to tell you to download a bunch of programs. You're probably going to hear about Awaken PoE Trade, which is a program that allows you to see values of items. You're probably going to hear about Path of Building, which is a basically a program that mimics the in-game skill tree and skills and items so you can build out characters in basically a spreadsheet to see what all of the data of your character would be and make changes to your character in the spreadsheet before you do them in game in order to not waste, efficiency. Now, I myself do not like these programs. I think they are extremely annoying that Path of Exile borderline requires these. I don't think you have to use them for your first experience in the campaign. If you continue to play the game after that, I would say look into Awaken PoE trade and what it would do for you on an economy side, especially if you are going to use a trade league system. You probably want to look into Awaken PoE as soon as possible then in that scenario. Otherwise, in my personal opinion, Path of Building is not required for your first playthrough if you're following a build guide, but there is one third-party system I would recommend for your first playthrough right from the beginning. That is going to be an item filter system. You can set different prerequisites for an item filter, and effectively what this does is make it where when items drop, they don't spam the floor so much you can't even see the ground. Path of Exile drops you a ton of loot and is assuming that you are going to use a filter to filter only down to the stuff you want. Now you might say, well, I don't want to figure out a filter. You are lucky, you do not have to. There are websites that already do this for you. So all you have to do is sign into PoE, pick if you want to do a never sync, softcore, hardcore, stable, ruthless. Just pick softcore for your first playthrough, put it on semi-strict or regular. This will filter out basically complete garbage that you're not going to use and make it easy enough to understand what is actually happening in the game. This is Filter Blade. I highly recommend Filter Blade. For this purposes, it is easy to understand, syncs into the game. So all you have to do is sign in there, click on whatever filter you want to use. It will immediately show up in your item filters. You can just click on it to swap your item filter, save it, and you're done. It's pretty much that easy. So this takes no actual knowledge of the game, just knowledge of how to click on buttons on the internet and to be able to actually use, and it will massively increase your experience of your first and further playthroughs. This is something that is basically mandatory if you do continue to play the game, or else the game is going to completely spam your screen with just too many items. They do imagine that players are going to use this when they build out this game. This is not like an optional third-party thing that, oh, maybe someone will use Awaken PoE Trade or Path of Building. They pretty much expect you to use an item filter. Okay, so at this point, you might be convinced to use a build guide, and you're going to ask, all right, well, how do I actually find these build guides? I myself, being affiliated with Maxrow, am going to recommend you towards Maxrow. You can go to maxrow.gg, browse games, click on Path of Exile, and then pick through the builds that are available here. When you click on the build, it's just going to show you one, if it's updated to the current league. So look at which patch it is. You can see all of the different league starters. A league starter is basically a beginner's league character right at the start of a new league. So you're going to use a league starter for your first time. It's something that's very easy to follow, and it's going to show you everything from what skill gems, items, etc. to use. You do not only have to use Maxrow. There are plenty of other websites you can use. For instance, my friend Gazi TV is an Icy Veins person. You could check them out. There's even YouTube guides. Zizarin, for instance, has a whole breakdown of multiple guides with tons of information on it. So there are plenty of creators out there creating guides for you. This should be the easy part to get to and understand how a guide works. So that's my argument for it. I was pretty anti, I don't want to use a guide in the beginning. I don't want to use third-party software in the beginning, and I still hate the third-party software. As far as I can tell, it's annoying that it's something that's pretty much required once you super get into the game. But for your first playthrough, recommend a guide, use a basic league starter. These are my arguments as to why, and do not feel like if you do that, then you're losing out on potential experience of learning the game, because in Path of Exile, there's literally always something to learn.